uh, a task force addressing the question of whether the league could advocate for the formation of a public bank. I joined it immediately, and then the league did decide to set up our committee, but we'll go into that more.
Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, here's what we're going to be doing. I will be talking about the state league privatization position, what banks do, and comparing private and public banks as far as their functionality. Stoney will take over and discuss the specific bill, which was Senate Bill 5188, and what happened to it during this last legislative session and where we go to from here. Next slide, please. So with great foresight, the league in 2011 developed a set of criteria for the question of how to decide whether a private entities could better perform public services. And the criteria fell into two major subject areas. The first one is, if it's going to go private, it should certainly better serve the public interest. That means it should increase efficiency, reduce government costs, and be managed in the people's best interest, not really the private interest. The second area of criteria was to better manage risk involved with private organizations. In the case of the banking, it means sufficient oversight, meaningful transparency, and the assurance of accountability should there be a problem. And so we use these criteria, except in the reverse, to the Public Banking Task Force used these criteria to determine whether it would be better to leave the banking in the private sector or move it into the public sector. Next slide, please. Did you know private sector banks create 97% of the money in circulation today? Next slide, please. And this is how they do it. This is also shared functions of private and public banks. So private banks and public banks both have to have an initial starting capital. Until last March 2020, private banks had to keep about 10% in reserves, meaning in their deposits, for making good on depositors' demands. Deposits are demand deposits in these cases. And so a public bank would or should have that reserve requirement intact. And it's a little discomforting maybe to consider the private banks have no limit on their ability to make loans. They both must have deposits. In other words, they have to be depository institutions. And with those in place, they can make loans and leverage those loans. And a very simple example is if they make a loan of $100, 10% reserve means $10 saved, $90 for the next loan, and so on. And they can do this 10 times. So essentially, an initial loan of $100 can be equivalent to loaning out $1,000. And of course, it follows the more money, the more leverage that a bank has. Next slide, please. So what are the advantages to a public bank? Well, they're concrete advantages. Private sector banks have very high operating costs, usually over 50%, around 60% of their income. And that's because, of course, they have lots of different branches and lots of employees. A public bank would have one office, a small staff, and therefore have very low operating costs. based on the Bank of North Dakota, which is the only public bank in the US at this time. They have about 10 to 20% of their income to cover their operating costs. Lower operating costs, lower expenses means that they can offer, a public bank can offer lower interest on the loans they extend. Next slide, please. So what else is different? Well, whose money profits whom? So let's follow the money. Next slide, please. So here we have the case as it is now in Washington State. So let's start with the taxes, and you have taxes that we write out to the treasurer and send to the treasurer, but the treasurer immediately puts all of its revenues into a private bank. And the one private bank then distributes money to the rest of the private banks in the state, local community banks, and credit unions. But for holding our money, which is actually a significant amount of money, like in the billions, they are able to use that and count that as part of their reserves. And so they're able to make loans aside from the business that they're doing in the name of Washington state government. And those loans do not have to be made within the state of Washington. They can be extended to anywhere around the country and the world. And all of the profits from those loans, the interest that they pay, the interest that they are paid, and the fees that they charge, then are sent to, if they're a big bank and not a local bank, then their profits go to headquarters, whether it's Wall Street Bank headquarters or Minneapolis or San Francisco. In any event, the money that is put in the local private banks is spent for public needs, to pay bills and so on and so forth, which means that that goes into the local economies and stimulates businesses and taxes. And so then we begin the loop again. But each time there is a fair amount of, shall we say, leakage out of the state of interest and profits made on the fact that they have our rather large deposits in their private banks. Next slide, please. So this is what happens in North Dakota. This is the other extreme, where you, instead of having everything managed in a private bank account and accounts, you have a public bank. And the first thing you'll notice is that there is no leakage out of the state. So people pay taxes in North Dakota. They send their checks to the treasurer, and the treasurer deposits all the revenue in one public bank. Then that public bank then disseminates that money around the state through the municipalities. And a big part of what the public bank does in North Dakota is partnership loans with local community banks and credit unions to make sure that there is enough money in those local budgets to do some of the larger, say, infrastructure projects. In North Dakota, the Bank of North Dakota also supports local businesses, small businesses, and student loans, and they're also in the home mortgage business. So they do all of those things, which right now we are precluded from doing. And not even considering in the public bank at this time for Washington. So again, that money goes into the local economies, but with no profits being siphoned off. So the stimulus increases businesses and incomes. And so taxes go back into the treasurer, and then we begin the loop again. What happens here is that the capacity of the public bank to make more loans is increasing over time. And over time, it's a small economy, but it has returned about $1 billion over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades. So next slide, please. So to summarize, private sector banks are using private, we're using private banks, using private banks cost us higher interest rates and more fees. It increases their loan capacity, increasing their profitability. The profits based on public money in private banks go to shareholders and bank executives. With credit unions, it's the same process, but profits are returned to the members. In a public sector bank, it's the most efficient. It has lower costs and lower interest on the loans it makes to local governments and businesses, and then and through local governments to businesses. And the state loan capacity bills because the profits are returned to us, and because the public bank has that same money multiplier capability. So money remains and circulates in our state economy. Next slide, please. The last thing to consider is the second group of criteria, which is does the private sector or public bank better manage the risk? All banks are at risk. It is a risky business and banks do fail. But what is needed to be put in place, whichever bank option is used, is sufficient oversight, meaningful transparency, and assurance of accountability. I would ask you to reflect upon the last, 4 decades where we've had the savings and loan crisis, we've had the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and during the 2010s, Wells Fargo was basically avoiding oversight and meaningful transparency for their checking account fraud, which you may or may not be aware of, but at least Wells Fargo has been held accountable, as opposed to the bankers that were involved with crashing our economy and, having a worldwide negative impact. No one there except one mid-level manager has been tried and sent to jail. So it's a little spotty on obtaining transparency and ensuring accountability with the private banks. I think it's also worth pointing out as a final item for your consideration is that it is the government that steps in and cleans up the messes. It is the government that is the ultimate guarantor of loans that have gone wrong. And it is the government that really is the last hope we have for getting things right, whether it's with a public bank or a private bank, which is not to say that public entities are not capable of having their own problems. They certainly have, as was in the case for some of the savings and loan banks. All right, with that, I'm going to turn this over to Stoney, and he's going to talk about our specific situation in Washington State. Stoney?
Yes, thank you, Ruth. There's been a bill to set up a public bank in the legislature for 10 or so years, and Senator Hasegawa has been the champion of that effort. This last session, he was joined by Senator Cooterer, who acted as the sponsor of this bill, SB 5188. As well as many others. And what SB 5188 would have set up, as it was first proposed in January, is something called the Washington State Public Bank. It was a cooperative, meaning that it was owned by its members, and the members under the bill would be the state plus any local and tribal governments that chose to join. The borrowers that the bill allowed would be the state and the local and tribal governments, so more or less the same as the members. The bank was going to be a public depository, meaning that it could receive tax revenues and increasing its ability to finance projects in the state. And it was going to be focused on infrastructure and economic development, although there was a provision saying that after 5 years, 35% of the bank's lending had to be focused on areas where there was a lack of low-income housing. In addition to the bill, the Senate proposed a budget for the bank. It included a startup loan of $10 million, and the budget said that the bank would come into existence once the state had appropriated $200 million as its membership contribution, and at least 20 local and tribal governments had invested collectively at least $50 million. So the bank would have started with an initial capital of $250 million, not inconsiderable, and on the basis of ordinary multiplier math, for banks would have been capable of lending something like $2.5 billion. However, something happened as the bill passed through the legislature. Quite early on, it was amended, and it was part of what the amendment did is change the name from Washington State Public Bank to Washington State Financial Cooperative. The members were going to be the same, but the borrowers were not. The state was no longer going to be allowed to borrow from the state bank. It was still going to be focused on infrastructure and economic development and the low-income housing, but it was not going to be a public depository anymore, severely restricting its financial capacity. And there are many of us who doubt that it is even a bank, and therefore just another revolving loan account which could lend up to the money on hand and then had to stop. So if the bill had passed in its original version, this is what would have happened. Taxes would have, still the bulk of our taxes would have gone into private banks, and they would have taken off their fees and interest and profits and sent them elsewhere. Some of it would go into the public bank or the financial cooperative, and it would lend for public projects in the state and make profits from those and return those profits to the members of the bank, those who had made capital investments in the bank. That is to say, the state and local and tribal governments. People have expressed various concerns about public banks, and we'll get into concerns about the private sector banks in a moment. But one of the concerns about a public bank is that political influence might play a part. The worry is that some dominant figure on the bank would hand out goodies to his pals. The operating board of the bank is set up so that 5 of its 9 members are elected by the members of the bank, that is state and local jurisdictions. 3 of them are appointed by the governor, and the state treasurer is ex officio a member of the operating board. And I suspect that the balance of those various sources of influence on the board would be checks on wrongdoing. And I'll also mention that the North Dakota State Bank has a supervisory board consisting of the governor, the attorney general, and the secretary of agriculture, all statewide elected officials. And one of its features is that over the decades, it's been in existence for 100 years, the policy of the bank has changed depending on the needs of the time. I won't go into the details of that, but so responding to general political feeling in the community is a virtue in a bank like this. Some have expressed concern about the risk of failure. Well, as Ruth said, banks can fail, but the bill, SB 5188, provides for very stringent credit protection measures, which should protect our bank from that eventuality. And another point to consider is that the borrowers from this bank, namely local governments, local and tribal governments, and if the bill were passed in its original form, the state, are pretty good credit risks. So they, you know, the likelihood of failure is slight. Some people have expressed a concern about whether the bill is constitutional under the provision of the state constitution that says the state can't lend its credit to private interests. Well, the state Supreme Court over the decades has issued a number of decisions saying that as long as there is a clear public purpose to the project that the government is financing, it doesn't matter that there is also a benefit to some private interest. And the prime example is Safeco Field. The Mariners clearly got a benefit, but so did the public. And the Mariners continue to pay rent for the stadium that the public built for them. So it's unlikely that the public bank would fail because it was unconstitutional. So if there are concerns about public banks, how about the concerns about private sector banks? Namely, 561 of them have failed just since 2000. And it's the same private sector banks that produced the 2008 crisis, effects of which are still being felt in Washington state as we speak. And those same private sector banks are still gambling with the money system, the basic infrastructure of our financial and economic well-being. And now they're doing it in the hundreds of trillions of dollars, many times the GDP of the entire planet. People are taking notice across the United States. And Ruth mentioned that the privatization position of the Washington State League was adopted in 2011. That was also a reaction to what they'd been seeing in 2008. Just a couple of years ago in California, the legislature passed a bill allowing cities and counties to set up public banks. In New Jersey, the governor has appointed a commission to design a public bank, and all of the red and orange and pink states are places where there's a bill in the legislature or a ballot measure or politicians campaigning on a platform that includes public banking. So we're part of a movement, and people understand that they need a bit of an antidote to the casino on Wall Street. And there's federal legislation. All of these acts have been proposed just in the last year or two. The real question is whether we're going to sit around and wait for the next crisis promoted by the gamblers on Wall Street, or whether we better set up preventive measures of our own. That's why we're having this caucus, in part. We want to get SB 5188 back on track, at least in its original form, and perhaps even stronger. We're communicating with the legislators involved to find out how best to do that. We think our main task will be making presentations like this with local leagues and with service clubs around the state to build support for the idea. So let's see, I see that there are 53 people in our session here. Cynthia, that sounds like about 10 breakout rooms, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to invite you to join a breakout room now and address these three questions. What are the most compelling reasons for setting up a public bank? what are the greatest dangers in setting up a public bank and how do you avert those dangers? And a bit of a strategic question, what are the ways to talk about public banking that will resonate with the most people? We'll put these questions in the chat so that you have them in the breakout rooms, and we'll give you about, let's see, it's now 11:30. We'll give you about 15 minutes. So we'll come back at 11:43, I guess. And if you would put your conclusions about these questions in the chat, we'll gather them all together and talk them over as a large group when you come back. So at this point, I think
Yeah, so
we
Stone,
can.
before we do that, I wanted to point out to the group that there have been several questions in the chat, and we will answer those questions when you come back from the breakout rooms. Ruth has been putting some answers in the chat, but just to make sure everybody's clear, we will answer those when you come back.
Thank you.
Helen, if you can hear me, I put you in a breakout room. We're in the process of those for about another 12 minutes. You may have to accept it.
Okay.
So for those of you who've just entered, we're doing breakout rooms. I've tried to assign you as you came in, but I will continue to do that, hoping that you will accept it and go to that room. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Wish I could start my video now. I've been trying to be inconspicuous.
Which room is this?
Well, which one did you get an invitation to?
Breakout rooms. Okay.
Yeah, they're all the same, and so, and I don't know why Helen hasn't accepted hers. So. You can stay here if you want, but it'll be 12 minutes or so until they come back.
Should I go to another room?
Well, did you get an invitation to go to anything?
Yes, on my phone. And then I touched it and it said room 2. Then I decided I didn't know how to really operate Zoom on my phone. So I came to my laptop and now here I am in 9.
And okay, so
or I'm being
I
assigned to
assigned
room.
to the room. I'm not sure why this isn't working. Well, you may just have to stick, you may have to stay here. I don't know what's going on.
Should I just join
I've got
breakout?
9. I don't know what's happening here, but let me try it. I've got you in room 9. And Carol Larson, I don't know what happened there either.
Let's see, breakout rooms. It says I've been assigned to 9, so I guess I'll press join.
Yes, please.
Do I do the same, Cynthia?
Yes,
This
please.
is, all right, thank you.
Carol, do you have a room assignment?
No, I don't.
That's funny. I'm not seeing.
Well, I just signed in late. So let me go back and maybe I do have one and I wasn't aware. Just a moment.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay, I've got you in room 10, but I'm not seeing. I'm going to move you just so you get a new notice. Okay.
that's fine. And then I have to click on that. Is that what you're?
Yeah. So you should have had a new invitation. There you go. Hi, I didn't have any way to put the questions for discussion into the chat because I
Okay,
didn't have them. So if you put them in the chat for me, I will put them in the message to all.
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna do this, and then I want to do,
We've got about 8 minutes left.
yeah, here we go. Oh, no, I want to go here.
Did you drop out of a room that? Yeah, you left.
Pardon?
You left 2 people by themselves in the room.
Yeah. So here is this, and now I'm gonna go to the chat. So I can put it in now and it'll go to everyone. Does that work?
No, I have to broadcast it to the small group. So put it in the chat. You can put it in the chat to everyone, but then I'll broadcast it.
Oh, okay. So here it comes. There.
Okay. Valerie, we're in the middle of small group discussion. So I'm going to send you to a particular room and ask you to join it. What I got was, I didn't get the questions for discussion. I got all the resource material.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Look, you're absolutely right. Questions for discussion. Okay, so I've got to do this, this, there, and there, and there.
Okay, thank you. That works better. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to broadcast to all, and I'm going to say we have 6 more minutes. Shoot. It went in without my questions. Okay, let me go again. Copy. Can't make it paste. Okay, just gotta type. I can't. There's a limit to the size of the message. Okay.
What's happening?
Oh, I'm typing. There's a limit to the size of the message.
Oh,
I also did not know I could not cut and paste. Do you want me to send you the questions that still need to be answered when they come back?
yeah, sure.
Okay, because I'm not sure that Ruth quite handled. I'm going to just send you a couple that I think are that more suitable for you to answer.
Okay.
So here we go to the chat. Isn't Ruth? Oh, here we go. So I would suggest that you open with these while people are putting stuff in the chat from their groups,
Okay.
and just so they don't get lost in the shuffle. Can you see why it would not behoove you to try and do all this management while also presenting?
I absolutely can.
It's a challenge. We got a bunch of people that entered while the small groups were in process. So ended up having a bunch of stragglers getting assigned.
Yeah. How many people are in the session all told at this point?
I don't have that number because they're all breakout rooms. I could
Oh, I see.
not, I don't think it's worth the time or the effort. I think we got about 5 more once we broke into small groups. What's the temperature like up where you are?
Oh, it's nice and warm.
That it's about 100 here. My house is sweltering.
I haven't looked at the thermometer. My house was built in 1926. Actually, it's a duplex, and I'm on the north side, so to a limited extent, I'm protected from the sun on days like this. But it has 1926 insulation, namely none. And so it eventually assumes the temperature of the outdoors.
Mine too. Yep. Okay, I'm going to close the rooms now so people will come back.
Great. It gives them a minute, I think, automatically.
We're down to 41 seconds. So what I'm doing is I'm saving the chat, but I'm pulling out questions to be answered at the same time. So we
Right.
can go through later and pull up all the points that were made.
Great, thank you. Somebody's still trying to get in.
Oh, yeah.
Here they come. More and more and more.
Yep.
That might be it. Okay. So before you all went off to the breakout rooms, there were a number of questions in the chat, and I thought I would address those first, and then we'll get to what you found out in the chat. So one question was this bill presented as original, or were these dollar figures put in as deal killers? Who amended the bill that way? The dollar figures were put in by as part of the Senate budget proposal in a separate process, whose elements I confess I don't fully understand. But if the bill to set up the bank had passed, then this would have been the budget proposal for it. And I'm not aware that there was anybody trying to kill the bill by putting in those dollar amounts. Second question, aren't private banks already exerting significant political influence? I would say they probably are, both here and nationally. Let's see. And so in a certain sense, our effort to set up a public bank, or to have one set up, is an effort to have our own political influence on how banking is conducted and for whose benefit. And then here, this is an interesting question. I heard that local governments thought this might be a solution looking for a problem, and that it could be a net loss for them. Ruth and I attended all the 4 hearings that were held on this bill, 2 in the Senate, 2 in the House, and at each of them, a representative of the Community Banking Association of Washington testified and said things like that. I don't think he was accurate in assessing whether there would be a net loss to the local governments. Our understanding is that, as Ruth said many times in the presentation, the cost of operating the public bank would be lower than the cost of operating either a big bank or a small bank, because of the need to have lots of local branches. And so that our bank, our public bank, could offer lower rates for borrowers, local government borrowers. So let's see, how do we proceed at this point?
Do you want people to put their questions and comment in the chat so that we can gather them up?
Okay, I see that
Without raising hands.
several have been put in. And I see that our references are now in the chat. That's good.
Tony, do you want people to put stuff in the chat, or do you want to raise hands, or both?
Why don't we raise hands at this point? If you have a question or a comment. And I see Karen has raised her hand. You must unmute yourself.
I'm Karen Verrill from Thurston County, and we had a couple of questions like, does this mean that we could personally have accounts in these banks, and would we have checking accounts and credit cards? And what about state pensions? Would they go into this bank, and would it be handled the same as it is currently?
The bank, as proposed in SB 5188, would not allow individuals to set up accounts. And the bill says nothing about the state pension funds being used as sources of funding, although potentially they could be. I mean, a bunch of other things a bunch of people would have to agree that that was a good thing to do. But potentially that's a possibility. Let's see, is there another question here?
Diane Ramsey.
Oh, Diane, yes.
Good morning. Diane Ramsey, Seattle. I was fortunate enough to be in a breakout room with Megan McNichols and Adele Reynolds. Adele and I were, along with Toyoko, on the League of Women Seattle King County privatization committee. It was a public bank committee that worked to get the public bank issue under our privatization position. So we shared with Megan the history of it, the fact that when we, as a city, a state, or county government, go to contract to push our services out to a bank or a utility, we use this privatization position pretty much, and these entities do as well, to determine whether that's what they want to do, if that's in the best interest of the public. The thought being that that process in reverse is what would support going forward with the public bank idea.
Exactly.
So we shared that with Megan, and to our surprise, she shared with us that the Chickasaw Nation has a public bank. And she is going to check and see what other Native American banks, private banks might be out there. And she's going to share that with you, Stony, and you, Cynthia, and the rest of your committee. So that's how we spent our time. We apologize for being slackers, but we thought that was a pretty good find, and that's what we'd like to share with you.
That doesn't sound very slack to me. But we, in fact, I should have mentioned the Chickasaw Nation Bank when I was showing you that big map, because, and we had a little green dot right in Oklahoma, right for that.
And she said they were successful, that they did not, during the crisis, they did not lose money. And she's going to check to see why. Was it because of their investment strategies, or, you know, what was the cause? And that'll help us as a community determine whether we, you know, whether this is something we really want to spread the word on. I mean, I think we do. I'm obviously behind it, but I think the more information we get, the better. So thank you.
So Nancy, you have a question.
Tony Rosen was next.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'll let you.
Well, no, I'm not speaking for our group. So let's let her speak.
Oh, I wasn't going to speak for our group, but I have a follow-up question for what was just discussed. Is there widespread support among the tribes in Washington State for the public bank?
And I don't know the answer to that question.
Good question. I think we should put that on Megan's list of things to determine or figure out for us, since she's going to look into other nations that might have public banks and dig into that whole issue and share that with you, Stony, in your committee.
Yeah, so one of the facets of all this that we didn't have time to talk about was that the Dan Evans School at the University of Washington did a study which was published last year, part of which was a survey of local governments. And I don't recall just offhand whether tribal governments were included in their survey, but they were just trying to assess interest in the idea of a public bank. But that's a good thing to check. Thank you. Sherry, I see.
Hi, I just want to report quickly about our groups and discussion answers to the 3 questions. So the one thing that was, clear is that we're all in the same boat of this is a pretty new subject area. We're learning as we are going. And so it's really, I'm glad that this is part of what we're doing at convention. And so the other thing is that one of the things about compelling reasons was that really great graphic of the circle that compared how the public bank is keeping their own community rather than having it leak out to other entities. And a good question again about the tribal support. That seems like a critical thing to understand for our state. And then questions around, would this public bank bring in things like driver's license fees? Is it deposited for all kinds of things like that? Because it was mentioned in the diagram, but there's a whole lot of other things that state collects. So question mark around that. And then I'll just go on quickly to the next 2 things about kind of the danger, and maybe it's public trust. If this is kind of the new thing, even though we just learned, I just learned that it's been before the legislature 5 times. Heck, I didn't know. So anyway, that was news to me. And so maybe there's an element of that there's not enough information about how this is a working model, like in North Dakota for 100 years. It's working just fine. And so the more that we can have people understand that this is something that can be trusted. And then the third thing about how to talk about, and we think that we should do something like a graphics where you have cartoons and they explain, that this is how money works right now. And then it's kind of a cartoon way to show the power of having a public bank. And my reference is that I work in the climate change arena, and you've probably seen the book about your cranky uncle. How do you talk about these issues? So it's a book that gives these really complex issues, cartoon images, and ways to talk about it. So maybe the same sort of thing could be done with a public bank.
If anybody knows about a good cartoonist, we want to hear about it.
Okay, I hope, group, did I do okay? Did I see everything? Yeah. Would we understand who the enemies are, of course, who in the legislature, maybe we can talk to our own legislators. Did you oppose it? Why did you oppose it? And then we need to have a dialogue because I think it's a really good idea and you represent me. So there's an idea. Okay.
It's a good question for candidate forums for our state people.
Yes, and we've proposed it as questions. So Paul, I see you have a question. We have 3 minutes.
This is a fast one. As part of the investigation for the feasibility of this, we should really strongly consider that there are a lot of requirements to be satisfied to be an actual bank, federal, state, and so on. So this would add to the overhead, both in personnel and administration, meeting all the laws and requirements that we need to consider when we think about this.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And our model for, in many ways, is the North Dakota State Bank, and they must have to comply with all those things. And still, their expenses, their overhead expenses are only about 10 or 15% of their income. Polly.
Yes, we put our comments in the chat, but I see questions about individual use versus what I understand public banking is. So I think the group, you should address that to make sure people don't misunderstand that it isn't for individuals.
Yes, yeah, good point. Good point. I'm going to share my screen now because we're just about at the end.
Look at the Bank of North Dakota there, Stoney. in
What's
chat.
that?
The Bank of North Dakota offers those services, it says in chat.
For individuals, yes, they do. There's only one branch that does that. It's in Fargo, and there's only one teller cage. So you have to drive to Fargo, and all they offer is checking. And I don't think they even offer credit cards. But so they have it, but it's very limited.
One other thing I'd mention here, Stoney, I think when we're reaching out to people and trying to present to them how public banking is a good idea, particularly in the rural parts of this state, Production Credit Association operated forever, and that's exactly what they did. They were a public bank for farmers and ranchers. They put their money there, they got their money out.
What was this?
The Production Credit Associations.
Oh, okay. That's a new one to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, so before we break up, here are few things that we think might be interesting for you to do. Whoops, there. One of them is to go to this website. The link is in the chat for the Friends of Public Banking. And that's a website where individuals or organizations can sign up as supporting the general idea of public banking. We would love to make this presentation to any groups that you belong to, league groups or other groups. And so we're standing by to receive your invitations to do that. If you haven't been to the legislative website, the link for this particular bill is in the chat. You can go there and indicate support or opposition to SB 5188, and also, if you choose, to provide a written comment. And all of that will go to your legislators. It's a very convenient way to comment on bills that are before the legislature. One of the great things to do would be to open a conversation with your city council or your county council, because if the legislature hears from city councils and county councils or school boards or PUDs or any local government entity, yes, we need this public bank, they're more likely to pass a bill that's pass the bill at all and pass a bill that is really going to do something. And if you're so inclined, we'd love to have your name and email address in the chat as someone who would like to engage in action alerts when those come up. They'll primarily be during the legislative session, but there may be others before then as well. Anyway, thank you so much. And onward and upward, I hope. So I'll hang on a little bit if in case anybody wants to continue on discussing this.
Please put the chat back in so we can see it.
So what has happened to the chat? Let's see.
It's because you're sharing.
No, you can bring it up. Click.
Okay, so I'm stopping sharing. There we go. Any more questions, comments, inspirations?
Thank you so much. So I found a little YouTube a little video on YouTube from I put it in the chat a couple times. It's cartoon-like and explains public banking, and it's from the Public Banking Institute.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've sometimes used it in our presentations. Yes.
Yeah, it's the first thing that comes up when you just put public banking in
I see.
YouTube, at least on my site. So it should be easy to find.
It's about a city park, I think.
Yeah, I just looked it up, put the paste in there. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
Okay, well, I think it's time to end. If you haven't put your name and email in the chat, please do so. And I'm going to shut this down in about 30 seconds.
Thanks so much. This was excellent.
Yeah.
It's been a delight.
Adele, very good to see you. You're muted. Adele, you're muted.
Okay, well, in any event.
There she is. So Adele was the person who told me that there was a task force looking into public banking. That's where I first heard about it.
Well, good. Talk it up. Talk it up with all your friends, because it's an idea whose time has come.
Definitely.
I agree.
Okay, well, I think just hang in there a bit. Okay, let's just debrief for a couple minutes.
Okay.
I'll shut it. I didn't want to shut it down until you had a chance to see how you felt about it.
Right. And I also have copied the chat several times to make sure I have it all.
So I'd be happy to take the chat, organize it, and send it out to you in a way that is useful.
That would be wonderful.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you,
Getting
Cynthia.
used to doing that.
Okay. I've been trying, but it takes me forever.
No, I've got a system in it. You know, I'll get that to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I thought that went real well. I thought there was a lot of enthusiasm. I had someone from North Dakota in my small group of 3. And so, of course, there's no hesitation on her part. So
I think that it would have been just a little, so first of all, your presentations were outstanding. Really good job. Really good. But if it'd been a little bit shorter, there would have been more time for dialogue. And so I feel like we kind of regret that it was that short.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Stony and I like to talk. And we feel like what we're saying is so important.
Well, yeah, and I think there wasn't any things to poo-poo in there, but
No, it needs to be tightened up.
Yeah, and it also leaves places for them to ask questions and get them more involved if we don't try to tell them everything.
Right.
So, well, that's a good point, and we will take it to heart and do that, because I think we have got it to the point where we don't need longer. Whoever we're talking to. What do you think? I mean, you know, when we go out to different local leagues and units, you know, I think that talk is pretty good.
Yeah, I do too.
So,
Well,
shortening it up a little bit.
But tightened up, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, it's kind of fun. It's an educational tool to do a poll before and after to see if you change anybody's mind. But that actually takes a lot of time to do that.
Yeah.
So,
well, I was struck by how much support there was in this group. So,
yeah.
Some of them didn't feel like they'd heard about it before, but they liked the idea.
Yeah.
Right.
The feedback I got was really? We could have money that we invest in our own, infrastructure? It's like, you mean we're leaving that on the table for the private banks? And so that kind of was a real selling point. And then the other one, of course, is, well, how come, and we get this question every time, how come there's not more public banks? And it's like, and what's going on in our legislature that we don't, they're not supporting this. And it's like, my only response to that is, well, it's worldviews, it's values. And there are people that are just against government. And we've had 40 years of
much longer than that.
well, I start with Reagan, because he famously said government isn't, government's the problem. And so we've been going, and that was the decade where greed became, the thing.
Greed
and
is
it was,
good.
it's still just, I can't believe that people think that way in this country, that the idea of public good, I don't care who's presenting it or who's doing it, that we shouldn't just be all for ourselves. That